you're like this interconnective tissue between starting with like the bands in the early 70s, 1970, all through the punk scene, and then up to Green Day even. Now, are you still
and
touring with bands and things?
And
White Stripes, yeah.
Not the White Stripes, the Stripes from Ireland.
Oh, okay.
They're young, about 18 years old. Really fantastic R&B band that brings back the spirit of early rock and roll, and really nice kids. That's my band that I really like. That's the youngest, newest band that I like nowadays. But yeah, along the way, I have interconnected with a lot of people because it occurs to me one day that somebody like Alice Cooper is always in Alice Cooper's dressing room. I remember like Tina Turner is always in Tina Turner's dressing room. So she was asking me one night, what's Madonna like? Because I had seen some of Madonna's very first shows at the Roxy and at the Danceteria in New York. And, when I went to England, they were asking me, what's this like? I remember being on tour in Japan with the Bay City Rollers, and they had this nice bus that had a videotape, a VHS machine. And I had VHS copies of videotapes that I had made of bands at Max's Kansas City, like Blondie and Robert Gordon and Patti Smith, and I had a documentary tape that I had made of the New York Dolls, and I was showing that to the Bay City Rollers, in Japan.
Right.
So I was in funny ways connecting all of these different groups. In fact, I showed those tapes to Kiss, also in Tokyo, when they were there, and we had a night off, and I rented a machine.
Kind of the things that with your books and with the documentary and things that I was watching last night and talking to you last night, is that there are the musicians and there's the bands, but then there's all these other people around the bands that kind of will connect these bands together, and they're just as much a part of the scene and just as much a part of the lore and the history of rock and roll as any of these bands are, probably even more so in many cases.
Well, I don't know if it's more so. I mean, the musicians make the band, but they don't, get anywhere without other people helping them. And a band does have to have an image. I mean, it occurred to me the other day, I had a doctor who told me he was in a band when he was in college, and I went back to look him up on the internet, and I realized the first thing I wanted to see was what they looked like.
Right.
And then I was going to see what their music was like, but I wanted a page to come up where I could see them. And an image says so much, that... the way people look is often the way they sound.
Right.
It's like, looking at a fine wine. You can tell by the label because the people who make the wine make the label, and you can tell by the graphics and the design where their taste level is, how they see things. And that's the same with a band, is how they dress to present themselves to the world is how they present themselves to the world. Iggy says it in my movie, when you see a guy with bright pants that cut off a little below the knee, and he's got some big silky kind of shirt and a foot-wide bow tie and giant, foot-long sunglasses, you got an idea of what his music might sound like, and so the image has quite a lot to do with a band, and, when they're advertising for a band, they can't play the music in a magazine or on the front of a club. They have to put a picture there.
Right.
And that picture has to show who's playing there and why you want to go and see them. And in the old days, with an album cover, you would look at the album cover, and that would pique your interest whether or not you wanted to go further and actually hear what these people, or sometimes it wasn't even the band, the Doors put out an album where there were these circus characters in an alleyway, and it was just this intriguing, interesting picture, and you kind of go, well, who made that? I want to hear what else they're making, so the album cover would draw you in. Nowadays people make videos, instead of album covers, so you go to YouTube and you see 10 seconds of a video and decide whether or not you're going to like a band. So the image has, as much to do with a band's success as the music they make.
And so many people don't want to believe that or admit that, but image is just as important as the music being made. What you're projecting as an image. There's some of the best musicians in the world you'll never hear because they don't understand.
Right.
Like
it's
that.
Show business. You got to put on a show,
right?
And if you don't put on a show, then there's some serious musicians who just want to play the music, and there are some people who just want to hear music. But I don't think, for me, if you go to a theater and you're sitting down to just hear music when your eyes are wide open and you're looking at somebody on the stage, they ought to be doing something,
right? Especially
since so many people can be doing something, and And so I gravitate towards those, and particularly myself, I like a visual act. That I'd rather see somebody like Kiss or Alice Cooper that really performs an act. It was interesting, actually, a couple of weeks ago, I went to see a band that when you hear their music, you don't think it's very theatrical. A band called 21 Pilots. It's a very popular band nowadays, and my granddaughter is infatuated with them, and for her birthday, I took her to a concert. And I was very much grandpa, wondering who this band was and not really knowing much about them. She was singing along to every word of every song and loving it. But I found it interesting that for this band, which is more about intellectual, about the music that they play, about the lyrics and what they're saying, that these kids love, was that in order to perform in a big place like Barclays Center, they had a somewhat elaborate, if minimal, kind of toned down, but still a very elaborate stage show where it wasn't giant video screens, but they did have a certain amount of video and lighting effects. They did a couple of really interesting tricks where I have seen before where an audience, a singer will go out and have the audience hold him up, and he stands on the audience while they're holding him and he sings. Well, in this case, the band is just a singer and piano player, the same guy plays piano and sings, and a drummer. And they actually had a couple of roadies come out with this platform and kind of floated across the front of the audience where they're holding up this platform, at which point the drummer gets out onto the platform and he's playing drums on being supported by the audience. And I thought, I've been around a long time. I never saw that trick. That's good, And another time when the singer is playing this long piano solo and he's sitting there, and at one point, 4 roadies come out and cover him with this big black cloth. And he keeps playing the solo, and when the solo's over, all of a sudden the spotlight comes on, and he's up on the 3rd balcony singing, like a magic trick. Like he suddenly... Because they had, some kind of dome inside the when they put the cloth over him, it's kind of a magic trick. There was like a dome where his head would have been, and he must have slipped out through a trap door and made it out to the side of the stage and up to the audience somehow, and he appears up in the audience. I thought, no, that's really good. That's a good trick. Yeah. And it's these kind of visual tricks that really amuse you, so you're not just playing the album sitting in your living room or seeing somebody repeat that, but you're seeing somebody put on a show that amuses and amazes you. And I like that kind of show. Yeah.